when the government isn't monkeying around too much in the economy, then the businesses kind of do their thing, and competition keeps them in check and makes sure that prices are affordable and that quality is high. That's the free market in action. There is a proper role for government in making sure the business climate is predictable and stable, protecting people from fraud, things like that. But pricing decisions reflect underlying costs, and businesses have to cover their costs. So there are a lot of different factors that drove up business costs during the pandemic. I mean, the lockdowns were number one, right? If it's hard to go out of your house because of some dictate from your governor, how are you going to interview for jobs until everybody gets used to Zoom and Teams and all that kind of thing?
Right.
But then there were other things. Some of the initial responses actually paid people more in unemployment than they would be getting from working. Makes it really hard to bring new workers into your facilities. But even so, Amazon...
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential. And here's your host, Jeff Crank.
Well, thanks for joining us for another episode of American Potential. You know, when you look at a chart and lines are going up, it could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing, depending on what those lines represent. Well, when it represents inflation, it's not good for American families who are now having to spend $11,000 more a year just to live the same lifestyle that they did just a few years ago. Now, another chart with the line going straight up would be how much Congress is spending. With Congress passing bills such as the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which cost $192 billion, and continuing appropriations acts of 2021, and the cost of $178 billion, and the amazingly named Inflation Reduction Act, with the price tag of $318 billion, which was passed by Vice President Harris's tie-breaking vote in the U.S. Senate. Congress's spending problem continues to make the spending line go straight up. Now, as Congress continues to spend, some are trying to blame businesses as the reason for inflation and not the overspending coming out of Washington. And Americans for Prosperity has put out the Bidenflation Blame Game report to tackle this question. But do Americans think it's government spending or businesses that is causing the cost of living crisis? Americans for Prosperity has been holding events around the country, and Matt Curran, who we've had on before talking about these events, asked people who is impacting the cost of living crisis. And we'll share some of those answers while we talk with our guest today, Kurt Couchman, who's the Senior Policy Fellow for Americans for Prosperity. You know, there's really only one thing, and I want to start this episode off by talking about this. There's really only one thing that drives up inflation, and that's the people that can print the money, right? That's the federal government. It's not the state government. It's not some of these others. Now, they can't put money into the economy. It's just the federal government, and that is what is driving inflation today, right?
That's right. Inflation comes from too much money chasing too few goods. If you look at the money supply, which is the amount of money sloshing around in the economy, it rose dramatically from right before the pandemic to today, but it rose especially fast in the first 2 years. And so it rose about 42% relative to pre-pandemic levels, while the actual economy only grew by about 4%. That difference is the inflation that we have seen and that we will continue to see until it works its way out of the system.
It happens this all the time. This isn't the first time in American history where there's been too much money thrown into an economy. We've seen it before, right?
We have seen inflation before, famously in the 1970s, and also right after World War II. This one's a little bit different because this one was clearly and directly driven by Congress's spending and debt. They not only spent during the pandemic, but before that, they'd been piling up the debt for years. And finally, the chickens came home to roost. And with the American Rescue Plan Act that was enacted in March 2021, right after Democrats assumed total control of the government, that's when the Federal Reserve lost control. They had been buying all this federal debt, most of the new federal debt that was created during the pandemic, because they were worried, I think, that there wouldn't be enough other buyers for it. So ultimately, the Federal Reserve became the lender of last resort for the federal government, which was never supposed to be the case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We see, and we'll talk about this much more in this episode, we see people, politicians who were responsible for this massive increase in spending. And by the way, we haven't gone back to pre-COVID spending levels at the federal level, right? We raised it as a government, and then we never brought it back.
Yeah, even as a percentage of the economy, it hasn't come back to pre-pandemic levels. Some of those things have been permanently increased, but we've also had the underlying retirement of the baby boomers, drawing more on Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid that is contributing to that. But there was definitely an expansion during that time.
So these politicians, though, that were predominantly responsible for the passage of some of these pieces of legislation that I mentioned, and for this massive increase in spending, they're trying to run and blame other people, right? And it's not, they're trying to say, well, it wasn't us. Look, it was somebody else.
Yep.
Typically they try and focus on businesses and say, well, it was a business that's causing inflation. Well, businesses, free market systems work. And there is a pressure on businesses to keep the cost of their goods and products down. It's called the free market, right? Because they have a competitor somewhere else who will do it for less than them. But businesses also have to cover their costs and make a small amount of profit. So it isn't them that's driving that up in a system like that. It's the government that's causing that. But we've seen more and more politicians. Your thoughts on that? Politicians who really are primarily responsible for this increase in spending now blaming business so that they can maybe avoid some of the consequences of their bad decisions.
Well, they're self-identifying. The people that are talking about greedflation and shrinkflation,
right.
It's almost like they have a guilty complex where they know what they did and they're trying to distract people from connecting the dots and blaming them for their policy mistakes. Right. So, yeah, I mean, it's ridiculous to claim that corporate profits are driving this. Corporate profits are typically about 10% of the economy. Guess what they are today? About 10% of the economy. Right. A little bit less, actually. They did bump up a little bit when Congress and the Federal Reserve were just dumping money into the economy, but so did lots of other things, state and local government balance sheets, a lot of people's personal accounts. So businesses were just, riding the ripples from that giant stone that was thrown into the water of the economy from DC.
Right. But again, in a free market economy, there are counter pressures on those profits, right? Like if you have a competitor who sees, oh my goodness, they've got all of this coming in, they're going to do everything they can to try, and you're going to have competitors come in and say, well, gosh, we've got gigantic profits here. So they're going to come into that market, which is going to create competition, and it's going to lower what they need to do to be competitive in that. So there's always that for a business. But that's why this isn't a problem in our economy.
When the market is functioning well, and sometimes there are barriers to competition that are created by government, and that's a problem. We need to get rid of those. When the government isn't monkeying around too much in the economy, then the businesses kind of do their thing, and competition keeps them in check and makes sure that prices are affordable and that quality is high. That's the free market in action. There is a proper role for government in making sure the business climate is predictable and stable, protecting people from fraud, things like that. But, pricing decisions reflect underlying costs, and businesses have to cover their costs. So there are a lot of different factors that drove up business costs during the pandemic. I mean, the lockdowns were number one, right? If it's hard to go out of your house because of some dictate from your governor, how are you going to interview for jobs until everybody gets used to Zoom and Teams and all that kind of thing?
Right.
But then there were other things. Some of the initial responses actually paid people more in unemployment than they would be getting from working. Makes it really hard to bring new workers into your facilities. But even so, Amazon, they had about 800,000 employees right before the pandemic in 2019. And then 2 years later, they had doubled their workforce to 1.6 million people. So there are ways that businesses can adjust, but it's not instantaneous, and they have to be responsive to the market conditions around them.
Right. Okay, let's talk about this report that you did and talk about what it showed.
Oh, absolutely. So this whole thing began because a reporter in Erie, Pennsylvania, reached out to Christine Revold on our comms team and said, "Hey, do you guys have any comment on this new report by Senator Bob Casey from Pennsylvania, claiming that corporate profits were driving inflation?" And so I took a look at this report, and a lot of it is about the pain that people are feeling from the higher prices. And we've talked about that a lot of times as well. We've all lived it. It's no question. But he ascribed the causation to corporate profits, and he did it in two ways. The smaller piece of this is that he cherry picked the start and the end date. He started right in the depths of the pandemic, second quarter of 2020, and then measured to 2 years after that when inflation was raging at its highest.
Sure.
And when you adjust for that, it comes down, the so-called corporate profit rate of increase comes down. But the big lie was that he didn't actually use a measure of corporate profits. There were a couple of important factors that his report did not adjust for. And if you want to have a proper comparison of these things, you need to adjust for them. When you look at actual corporate profits over that period of time, you see that they grew essentially with the economy. We mentioned before that they're about 10% of the economy. They were all throughout the 2010s, about 10%. They bumped up to 11, maybe almost 12% during the pandemic when all the money was flooding in. They're back down to about 10%, maybe a little bit below that. And of course, corporate profits are financing people's pensions, their retirement accounts, their life insurance, things like that. So it cycles back to individuals at the end of the day anyway.
So one of the questions that we asked folks was, what do you think has a direct impact on inflation? Is it government spending or is it businesses? Now, here's what they had to say.
Government spending. I'm still flabbergasted by the fact that the reason why inflation is occurring is because we are the government. The government is printing more paper money, which make costs go high. But then the government is sending money to other countries and nations by the millions and billions of dollars. And it's like we must suffer for all of this. And I'm trying to comprehend, where does it make sense?
Oh, it's government spending. And we feel that pinch both at the federal level and at the state level here in Texas. Our state government grew, their budget grew by over 40% over these last 2 year period over the biennium. So there's got to be some way that we should be able to curb both federal and Texas state spending.
Government spending. The businesses don't have a choice. They have to pay a lot more for their products to sell to us because the price of oil has gone up. Our administration is buying it from everybody but us, and they're at a very high cost. They're buying it from Iran and other places and not allowing us to produce it.
We see too much overspending with our government. I think we need more accountability with our budgets. I think if we have a state where we have an extreme budget, then we need to limit our spending. And I think if you do have an excess, that maybe you need to give that back to the people.
Well, I mean, your thoughts on that. It does seem that at least these citizens make the connection. Now, not everybody maybe makes that connection, but these folks do understand that. American people are pretty smart about that. Your thoughts on that?
Oh, absolutely. And there are a couple of different themes that came out in those conversations. One, people identified the spending driving the inflation, and it does through the monetary expansion through the Federal Reserve accommodating the fiscal policy of Congress and the White House. There was another person who talked about the regulatory side. And that has been incredibly important in the last couple of years between state and local government lockdowns. And then also with the Biden administration's aggressive regulatory agenda. It's been on energy, it's been on labor, it's been on a whole host of things where the regulatory burden was not as high right before this administration began. But then when they got all their people in there and they wanted to direct favors in different places to green energy or unions or whatever else, they imposed new regulations that changed the expectations of businesses and workers and forced higher costs onto them in order to accommodate all of these special interests that they wanted to support. So it's the combination of the money supply growing and the real economy, the real production of goods and services that is really squeezing people with the inflation.
So following up on that a little bit, I mentioned in the opening some of the bad laws that were passed, some of the laws that, just piled billions upon billions of dollars of spending onto basically the backs of the American taxpayers and caused inflation. But what are some of the bad, and you mentioned some of them, just some of the bad policy decisions that have been made that maybe have driven up inflation as well?
Yeah, I would characterize it as really three phases rather than three discrete pieces of legislation. One phase was 1965 to 1972, the Great Society, that created the structure of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid that we have today. The baby boomer generation has largely retired and people are living longer. That's a wonderful thing. These programs need to adjust to accommodate for that, and they don't. So that's part of the situation. The second phase was around the Great Recession. So this is roughly 2007 to 2010. This also happened to coincide with the speakership of one Nancy Pelosi. This is relevant because the House of Representatives is the body of Congress that is predominant in fiscal policy. People talk about presidents. Guess what? Presidents don't write the laws, and revenue measures have to originate in the House. You see that the debt to GDP ratio, the debt burden on the economy, it actually started coming down during the Gingrich-Clinton years, and then kind of grew slowly in the early 2000s. But then once Democrats took control of the House in particular, and then also the Senate, and then also the White House, it just exploded during that 4-year period, kind of came back down, or slowed down, I should say, during the years where Speaker Boehner and Speaker Ryan presided over the House. And then in 2019, when Speaker Pelosi retook the gavel, the 4 years from there, it just exploded again as a share of the economy. So that really created all of the fuel that ultimately lit the fires of inflation in 2021, again, when the American Rescue Plan Act, $1.9 trillion being dumped into the economy like that, with most of the money going out the door within a period of months, which is incredibly unusual. So that was something that was passed under unified democratic control. And most of the things that drove up the spending and the debt burden during that time were passed with either entirely or predominantly Democratic votes. And I don't say that as like an anti-democratic thing.
That's
it's
facts.
just these are facts.
Those are facts.
And I want them to be better, and we have to point out people's mistakes if we want them to be better.
Yeah, not that Republicans are great on spending.
Not perfect, not by a long stretch.
They're less bad.
It's a relative thing.
It is a relative thing. So one of the other questions we asked folks was about politicians, their thoughts on politicians who, instead of blaming government spending, blame business for inflation. And this is what they said.
Well, they like to blame somebody else. They always like to blame somebody else, and they're trying to fool people and control people. Just like the fact that like big business, people say, well, they don't pay enough taxes. Yes, but they create jobs. Big business create jobs, and the employees pay the taxes, but the money comes from the same place.
The businesses themselves are trying to survive right now. The businesses are also feeling the heat from the government. They're not really making the figures they're making like 4 years ago. I mean, it's like everything it's pertaining to the government. There's no money, there's no allocation of resources to the general public as a whole. And I would put that it's like the attention is being diverted somewhere else entirely. It's not towards the people as a whole, because I don't really think this government really cares about the people right now.
90% of the people that do that, whenever you see Congress that does that, they never owned any businesses. We have Joe Biden, President Biden right now. He's never done anything. He's been a career politician all his life. And it's kind of funny how politicians go into this Congress. We had a friend of a family that went into Congress and promised only 10 years and now 40 years or whatever in. And they go in as like with only $100,000 in net worth, and then they become multimillionaires. How does that happen? Like, how does Nancy Pelosi and her husband get to do, they have the right to go and do insider trading where we don't. So they create themselves the elite status. And then, it's we as citizens, first of all, I think where you guys do very well, I know for Americans for Prosperity does, is trying to keep them accountable.
If it wasn't for the business, and it's crazy because they're blaming, everybody have to put the blame on somebody. Obviously, it's their fault because you have access to print the money and you're the only one who has access to send money away and spend it on garbage, not even spending it to take care of the people who voted for you and who put you in office.
I mean, there we hear it again. I think people get it. They understand what is causing inflation, or at least these people do. To me, that's the real important thing, is we do need to connect in people's minds this inflation and the problems that American families are having right now, just keeping up with inflation. We need to connect that to the bad decisions of government, right? Of policymakers, politicians, and others. Politicians are going to do everything they can to avoid the blame for that. They're going to blame whoever else. It's almost like the kid getting caught with their hand in the cookie jar. No, it wasn't me. It was my friend, or it was my sister or my brother who did it. Politicians are always going to be like that, but it's up to us, Kurt, to hold politicians accountable so that we continue to focus, so that mom understands whose hand got caught in the cookie jar, or the citizens understand that it's politicians doing this, right?
Absolutely. So there's two groups of members of Congress that have co-sponsored what's called the Shrinkflation Prevention Act. This is a Senator Casey bill that would essentially empower the Attorney General, the Federal Trade Commission, and state attorneys general to go after businesses that are doing unfair price things, whatever that means.
Yeah,
and nobody can really define it, right? But it's amazing that they are creating problems, blaming business for the problems that they themselves created, and then threatening to add more government oversight to businesses that are just trying to stay alive. But the two groups of people that are on this legislation are people in endangered districts. So in the Senate, or endangered states, you have Senator Casey, he's the ringleader, and then you've got Sherrod Brown in Ohio, and Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin, Jackie Rosen in Nevada. Senator John Tester from Montana has not gotten on this. Neither has Tim Kaine, and good for them. They've got other issues, but that's all right. And then the other group are kind of the hardcore progressives, where fringe theories like greedflation tend to hang out. So you've got Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Sheldon Whitehouse, and that sort of folk.
Yeah. And again, I mean, it's just trying to avoid the reality of what causes inflation, right? And so it's very frustrating. Families are dealing with the cost of living. Businesses are dealing with it as well, right? Businesses have to adjust to rising labor costs. They have to adjust to the rising cost of, their products, or the inputs to their products. So businesses are victims in this, just like families are, of politicians in government making bad policy choices.
Oh, 100%. So Popular Mechanics did a rundown of all the shortages that we had during the pandemic. And you remember bare lumber shelves at Home Depot and baby formula and lots of other things.
Right.
And a lot of that was due to bad government policy. So in the case of baby formula, there's perfectly good baby formula in Europe, but you can't bring it over because of the trade restrictions that we have. We have tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber, and you could go on and on down the list. But that shows that businesses didn't actually want their first response to be raising prices. They had a stock. They were scrambling like crazy trying to get more stuff to restock what people were buying up with all this cash that had been provided to them by Congress. And it was only when they realized that they weren't going to be able to get people to ramp up production enough that they were like, well, we can't be having shortages, so we're going to reluctantly have to raise prices. And that has caused a lot of heartache for people. I mean, when you go to the store, you see that the store that you're buying from has raised the price, but I have to remind myself when I go to the store that they're the messenger.
Yeah.
Right.
They're
not the ones sending the signal. They're just transmitting the signal that was created by the government creating inflation in the first place.
Right. Yeah. They have a formula, right? If you go to Walmart, or you go to Target, or you go wherever to shop, They have a formula. They need to make a certain little bit of profit off of that. This isn't them saying, well, we're going to, as you said, move our profit from 10% to 20%. They're trying to keep that 10% profit. And in order to do that, the things they have to pay for are rising, whether it's utility costs or transportation costs for the goods and services, or the goods and services themselves that they provide are costing them more. That's what causes them to have to raise the price.
Absolutely. And business profits generally are about 10%.
Right.
Grocery stores have a margin of about 2%.
Yeah.
Robert Reich, former labor secretary for, I think, President Clinton, has been out there talking about Kroger's profit margin. He's talking about gross profits. That is the difference between what goods are sold for, your revenue, and what the cost of acquiring the goods is. And he says that's about 20%. But that's the wrong measure, just like Senator Casey, because it's not just goods in and goods out. You have to have a facility. You have to run it. You have to pay rent. You have to pay employees.
Right.
And that's all part of the economy.
Sure.
So once you net out, taxes too, of course. Once you net out all your costs, Kroger's had 1.6% profit margins. That's tiny, even compared to other businesses. It's a really competitive sector.
And you would think that a guy like Robert Reich would be smart enough to understand that. Or do you think he is smart enough?
Maybe just. I think he's playing a game.
Playing a little bit of a game.
Yeah,
I think so.
Shape the narrative.
Yeah, I think that's right. So what can Congress do? And by the way, somebody the other day told me, and I couldn't believe this, but I looked it up, and it's very close to this number. They asked me how much a jar of mayonnaise cost in the store. And I said, well, I don't know. I haven't bought mayonnaise. I won't put you on the spot. But, I was like, I don't know, $5, something like that. That seems like a lot for mayonnaise, right?
Yeah.
It was $9 for a jar of mayonnaise. $8 to $9.
Like the Costco jug?
No, a regular jar of mayonnaise.
No kidding.
It's unbelievable.
Wow.
I mean, and there are things like that people can latch on. Like, it's not just mayonnaise, but there are certain things that eggs, eggs are something that people are like, man, what's a dozen eggs now cost? And it's just gone so much. Yeah, they are all over the place. But, things like that, that's the real impact of what these bad decisions are being made in Washington, D.C.
Yep.
So what can Congress do if they want to drive down inflation? Now, some of these costs are probably going to stay where they are. It's always hard to drive stuff down to where it was before. But if we want to slow the rate of inflation, what should Congress do?
Don't make things worse. So when the spending and debt binge ended, or slowed down at least, that's when we saw the inflation coming back down. There's a famous saying in economics that monetary policy has long and variable lags. In other words, it can take a while for the bad decisions to kind of work their way through the economy, and it can kind of happen in different ways. But as long as Congress doesn't add to the debt burden in a big way in the near future, then that won't force the Fed to monetize the debt, and they'll be able to continue contracting their balance sheet down to what it was before the pandemic, and they still have a ways to go. In the long term, though, we have a real challenge in that the debt as a share of the economy is growing. The debt held by the public is about the same size as the economy right now. That means it's already undermining economic growth by a significant amount. As the debt continues to grow, it'll undermine economic growth further, and it'll push up interest rates. At some point, we don't know exactly when, there's likely to be a debt crisis. And if that happens, then there will be financial and economic turmoil. There could be some real national security challenges, because one of the things that we can do quickly is pull our troops out of the rest of the world to save the money, right? And which power vacuum's dangerous thing. So we need to change the debt trajectory. So we need to grow the economy faster, and we need to reduce the debt growth. There's a lot of wasteful spending that needs to be cut. Politically, that's hard to do, but one of the things that we're working on is a comprehensive approach to fixing the way that Congress and the federal government do budgeting. You had a great episode with Akash Chogali back in, I think it was April of 2023, talking about three of them. And just to recap the biggest ones briefly, Congress doesn't do a real budget. It never has. Congress does appropriations, which are great, very important, but they're only 26% of spending and they're 0% of revenue. And it only involves one committee, the Appropriations Committee. They do great work every single year, but you need to get all of the committees of Congress, managing all of their programs on an annual basis, so they know what's going on and can find ways to increase value for the American people, including by reducing spending that isn't worth doing. So that's the biggest one. There is bipartisan legislation on that. Also, better budget targets is really important. The Responsible Budget Targets Act, which has been introduced by House Majority Whip Tom Emmer from Minnesota and Senator Mike Braun from Indiana. Really good stuff. It's basically modeled after the Swiss debt brake, which has been incredible for getting their debt growth under control. And then getting us off this crazy cycle of government shutdowns that lead to bloated omnibus bills right before a holiday deadline. That pushes members out of the conversation and leads to everything being done in closed doors, and then members get an up or down vote on it, but they're not really participating in that process. So those are the three big ones, but there's a whole list that we could get into some other time perhaps. We need to get the spending under control and the debt under control, and that's not going to happen to the degree that we need unless and until we fix the budget process.
Yeah, it should scare, and I've used this example on different occasions, but it should scare the American people that right now, well, if you look at our Constitution, the main responsibility of the federal government is to provide for the common defense, right? The Defense Department. We now spend more money servicing the debt than we do on national defense. If that isn't a warning sign to America, I don't know what is.
Yeah, it's really scary. And things could go off the rails very quickly. People sometimes will ask me, well, how do we know? Like, what are the signs that things are going to unravel at some point? I'm like, by the time that it's obvious that things are unraveling, it is too late to change policy to deal with it.
Right.
So we either get ahead of it now. And the message that resonates with most members of Congress isn't, oh, the deficits and debt are really bad and financial crisis and all that. It's, you're shut out of the process by this bad system. Don't you want to matter as a legislator?
Yeah, right.
And they do.
Yeah.
So that's great.
Yeah.
And so it does have the ancillary benefit from their perspective of dealing with the deficits and debt. But for them, the main motivation is getting to participate in the legislative process in whatever way works for them, whether they're a policy wonk or a communicator or a coalition builder or whatever.
Right. And the warning signs are there. We're seeing them, right? I mean, one warning sign would be if you're spending too much money on debt, more than you are on national defense. That should be an alarm bell that goes off. And there's many others. The problem is, as this gets closer to a crisis, we're going to hit a point like the nation of Greece did, and they had to put in place austerity measures, as they called them. I mean, we're not immune from that. That's going to happen here. And the decisions that we make are going to be much more difficult the longer we wait. If we solve some of this now and start taking measures now, it's going to be much easier for us to deal with it than if we wait until the end game.
100%. I mean, Greece also got bailed out. Don't forget that part.
Sure.
But who's going to bail out the United States?
Yeah, who bails us out?
Nobody.
Right.
It's not possible. And so that's why it's so crucial that Congress has the ability every single year to chip away at problems, whether it's the deficit and debt or the looming Social Security and Medicare trust fund depletions, or just the waste and the uncoordinated programs. They had Jim McGovern, a Democrat from Massachusetts, complaining about how there's all these different food programs in the different committees and how it's impossible to coordinate them. And we need something holistic to manage them. And whether or not you think that food programs are appropriate for the federal government, if the federal government's doing stuff, they should be coordinated. It should be logical and coherent and make sense. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of potential for getting these fixes in place. We just have to keep working at it.
Yeah. Well, Kurt, I appreciate you joining us and talking about this issue. It's critical. I mean, it's got to be one of the top issues that America faces right now, for sure, is our debt and our debt crisis as we're going. And certainly inflation is the issue, I think, that Americans are talking about and care most about right now, because it hurts them on a daily basis. So thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much for including me.
Yeah, you bet. Well, listen, we've talked a lot about this issue on a lot of different episodes. And we've talked about what you can do. And one thing you can do for sure is call your member of Congress. You can call your United States senators, and you can tell them, stop spending excessively. Tell them to get spending under control. That's their job, is just like your job as a family, is to make sure that the money coming in and the money going out kind of match up. And we haven't been doing that for a long time. So it's up to you to take the time to do that. And if Americans aren't going to take the time to do that, it's going to make the problem worse. Politicians do want to hear from you. They want to know where you are on these issues. So there are other people telling them to spend the money, whispering in their ears, telling them to spend the money. We need you whispering in their ears to tell them, no, think long term. Think about what this does to America's families and to our country. So it's very, very important that you do. Listen, follow us on YouTube. All of these, of course, are done on video. Every episode of our podcast, you can find it on our YouTube channel. We'd love to have you watch there. Of course, you can listen to us in your car as you're driving, because I don't actually want you to watch YouTube while you're driving. So you can listen to us. The audio version on any podcast platform is American Potential. And by the way, send me an email. I'd love to hear from you, jeff@americanpotential.com. And we'd love to hear your thoughts and comments about the show. Thanks for being with us. Go out there, defend liberty, defend freedom, defend America. This is a great place. And if you aren't there to defend it, nobody will. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.